Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank the Getty and all who organized the IMF for putting this forum together under such insurmountable odds. I'm Vincent Avalos, and I'm so happy to present what has been a project I wanted to do my whole career, the seismic mounting of a Noguchi sculpture. Isamu Noguchi is an artist I've studied and admired since my school days. This is the seismic mounting of the seeker sought. The exhibition we received is called Changing and Unchanging Things and focuses on the connection between the artists Isamu Noguchi and Saburo Hasegawa. The sculpture consists of a 1-ton basalt stone sitting atop a pine stand salvaged from a raised temple. We received the sculpture from the distinguished Noguchi Museum in Queens without any mounts, pins, or hardware of any kind. Obviously, the weight, seismic concerns, and geometry of this sublime sculpture will make for a very challenging mount. Adding to these difficulties are the aesthetic decisions that must be made. The simplicity of the form of many modern sculptures causes any mount put to them to drastically alter the artist's vision. These are photos before and after the mounting process, one taken unmounted at the Noguchi Museum and one at the Asian Art Museum. Perhaps I should have given a spoiler alert, but I wanted you to glimpse the finished product before I showed the details and amount of work put into it. I imagine there will be opinions as to whether the mount was too hidden or not hidden enough. Should a seismically robust mount be maybe even more obvious so that it is distinct from the sculpture? Or should it be camouflaged and formed to blend into the work so as to be in the spirit of the piece? Can a mount design take liberties with the artist's intent? Does it make it into something else? I wished to consider Noguchi's intention as best I could while keeping the mount tastefully visible. I'm very appreciative of the registrar Larry Giacoletti of the Noguchi Museum for allowing me to thoroughly study and template Seeker Sot, as well as other sculpture in the exhibition. Not only did it allow me to mount the sculpture as best I could, but I felt I was able to see it as few others are allowed. I'd like to share some of these study photos. These slides give a very clear idea of the fragility and precariousness of the sculpture. You can see here daylight coming through at the touch point between base and the sculpture. These pictures seem very similar, but were valuable references in templating and reconstructing future mock-ups. This is a picture of the underside of the middle beam. I found this detail fascinating because it reveals what looks like two graphite pencil marks here and one here, which is curious because it means either graphite pencils were used to register cuts on this beam in the time period this temple was built, or Noguchi purposely altered the beam to mimic joinery from a past era. Here we see the distribution of the base of the stone over the pine stand. To analyze this piece, I considered these 6 parameters: acceptable design restraints, mass geometries and center of gravity, earthquake forces in the gallery, force of overturning moment, vibrational period, and stable shape analysis. I worked with our curator, Karen Owen, to discuss acceptable design restraints. We investigated the least offensive way of grasping the sculpture. It was decided to attempt to keep the front of the sculpture as unobstructed as possible, that being decided by the fact that the sculpture had a definite front and was displayed previously with its back close to a wall. Of course, we need to consider mass geometry and the object's center of gravity. For mass, we relied on weights given by the Noguchi Museum. The sculpture's center of gravity is 48 inches from the floor. We used measurements from the sculpture itself and photos to get accurate scale and geometries to model the work. The calculated forces in the gallery were acquired from the primary analysis of Paul Rodler, the seismic engineer who retrofitted our building. Our building is fitted with elastomeric base isolators, which when inputted with a maximum credible earthquake, that would be the big one here in San Francisco, would cause the floor to move at less than a quarter of a G. The overturning moment was calculated at 3,400 inch-pounds. This information allows me to estimate the strength of materials and fasteners needed to resist the anticipated forces. The base isolated building itself has a period of 2.4 seconds. Looking at our original spectral analysis produced by our seismic engineer, I investigated this sculpture's propensity for resonance. I start to get worried when objects begin to approach a period over 1 second. I believe that it had a period that would approach a second or more. I used analysis of similar sized sculptures to come to this conclusion, coupled with the fact that its period would change eccentrically during the duration of a seismic event. This is due to the fact that it is stacked and unfastened. With this information, we can calculate stable shape with mass and geometry interacting with lateral forces and gravitational resistance. If you wish more details on these methodologies, I have written a brief paper which can be found on the Asian Art Museum website under Conservation. The mount design I finally came up with after a few months of study is shown here. I did a series of detailed drawings to aid my cohort Yutong Yuan and myself to navigate us through the process. The mount consists of two steel plates that form to the inside of the legs of the stand. So here's a plate here showing front, and here it is in the back. They go along the inside of the stand and to the back wall. They attach to a back plate and a top plate that interface with the connection of the stand and stone. So this is the top plate under the stone, and this is back of the sculpture here. These are welded together. The legs are also attached to a wall frame here, and three arms are then mechanically attached. One to the bottom of the top plate here, and the other two arms attached mechanically to the back plate. The drawing on the right is a cross-sectional view showing how the back of the top plate interface with the stand and the stone. This marked in yellow. It's the top and the back plate. These plates are welded together. In pink are the arms. This is the side view. And then there's an arm here and shown in 3/4 view to see what it will look like. On the left is the view rotated. The arms are now yellow. We are looking at the back view where you can see 3 bolts and the receiver flange. 3, and this right here is the receiver flange for the mount to rest in. The right drawing details the wall-mounted receiver plate. The Noguchi Museum allowed me to make cardboard templates directly from the sculpture. I used these to make the wooden templates shown that are the exact size of the steel parts. With the help of our designer Marco Sentin, I had these templates photographed and converted into vectored CAD drawings, which a local machinist used to CNC the parts out of 1-inch thick steel with a water jet. This slide shows the original templates made with the sculpture and the plywood templates, the exact size of the parts. The design of the arm looks somewhat sculptural, though I have been influenced by Noguchi and my intention was to be tasteful. The tapering shape had more to do with structural and mechanical issues than with aesthetics. Here is the top plate template illustrating the footprint of the stone. As a means of both attempting maximum accuracy and having a sculpture to design and assemble the mount to, I created this mock-up of the original Noguchi stand. As fine an artist and craftsperson Noguchi was, the stand was not absolutely symmetrical. I used the template from the sculpture to angle the legs in the precise way they were in the original sculpture. You can see in this close-up of the angle, it may seem slight, but since there are so many parts and so many places for this mount to go astray, I wanted to keep as many parameters in check as I could. These arms will be attached with several fasteners. One of the fasteners goes through the arm. This jig was created to hold the arm at the proper angle while the holes were being drilled. Here we see how it works. There were receiver holes and countersinks to be drilled in these arms as well. Receiver holes fitting welded nuts to increase embedment and deep countersinks for caphead screws. Here it again may seem like I'm attempting to duplicate Noguchi. However, it has always been my predilection to soften the edges of mounts. This has no structural significance, but for my taste, it gives a more pleasing form. This is the forming of the front arm. As per the curator's request, only one arm was allowed to be viewed in front. We also wanted it to be as small as possible, but still have the requisite strength to withstand seismic forces. In this case, we added additional steel. We attempted as best we could to have the form of the mount complement the sculpture. My cohort, Yutong, made these wells, which are much better than I could have done. These had to be impeccable since they had not to only fuse these plates, but have enough penetration to be ground down and have no pitting. This was done with several plug welds and bead welds all around. Here we can see the hole being drilled for bolting onto the base plate, and to the right the arm in its finished shape. Note that you can't see Yutong's weld. Phenomenal craftspersonship. I didn't want to rely just on the one bolt, so we connected flanges to the sides in order to increase the amount of fasteners. This is the finished arm. It might also be a prototype for Boba Fett's starship, or perhaps a 21st century hood ornament. To the left we see different parts being clamped to the base mock-up. We would clamp the different pieces into place, then lay out welding and machine fastening connections. We worked one step at a time, always reassembling the mount on the mock-up and checking other templates to be sure of the mount's accuracy. On the top of the mount, you can see some UHMW sheeting being fitted. 2,000 pounds would crush foam or felt, especially in point-loaded areas. UHMW has a high compression strength, is archival, and won't damage the basalt stone. On the far right, we can see the nearly finished mount standing on its own. Here is Yutong detailing some of the connections. These are detail shots of the back arms. This shows the arm by itself and on the left being fastened to the back plate. The arms are made of 1-inch thick steel plate. and are being fastened to 3/8" plate with 5/16" bolts. The bolts would have only a few threads into the 3/8" plate, so we welded on receiver nuts that not only properly fasten the plates, but locate the arms in their proper position by being inserted into a countersunk hole. Fast forward, here's the finished top section with welded receiver nuts. The top plate and back plate are welded together in order to keep the plates at the right angle during fabrication, and to add extra strength, we made a center gusset. Here it is being cut by hand. Old school. Way before the CNC or plasma cutter is set up, I'll have sliced through this steel. You can see here where the gusset and receiver flanges are tacked in place. The receiver flanges help locate the arms and strengthen them by inhibiting their side-to-side torsional rotation. In order to assemble the mount around the sculpture, most of the parts have to be mechanically fastened. Creating an interlocking architecture ensures proper location of the hardware, as well as absorbing some of the forces the hardware is taking. Once everything looks properly aligned, we will go over the tacks with solid welding beads. When painting out the arms, we decided not to give an exact faux treatment to the surface of the sculpture, but to just give a color to fool the eye at a glance. We also considered the different views one would have, as you will later see. The top plate is now ready with UHMW and painted. The wall we attached to was designed to carry significant loads. Steel framing covered in structural ply, then finished with sheetrock. The screws are rated each at 1,000 pounds of shear. That's at the structural ply. The sheetrock would be easily crushed by the shear forces, causing the screws to bend or pull out of the ply. Knowing this, we cut the sheetrock out of the area of the steel frame and added another layer of structural plywood. Now, not only would the frame be mounted directly to the ply, but the screws would have the proper embedment. The mounting plate is now ready to receive. Okay, the mount fits the temple stand. Here we're preparing to fly the eagle for takeoff. And the eagle has landed. So far, everything fits perfectly, but we're not out of the woods yet. We have to do the final fitting of the arms, which will take a couple of days. In the interim, we've strapped the seeker down. The arms were tastefully painted and ready to go, but the paint layer made the arms too tight for their receivers. That's what grinders are for. Once they slid in place, we added some epoxy putty to get an exact fit to the jagged back. Here's the epoxy putty here and here. We used 5/16" bolts to fasten the arms. To reach in these tight areas, we made special wrenches. The front bracket, fortunately for us, fit like magic. Set screws in the side of the receiver flanges were put in place to eliminate any torsion, no wiggling allowed. We can now see the seeker. No camouflage here. This view would only be seen if the guard were not in the room. We decided to paint the back of the mount the wall color. If they were painted the sculpture color, it would, in my mind, alter the seeker significantly. My feeling here is that we can see the mount, but it is not a complete eyesore. It had to be a little bit of a beast in size, with 6 fasteners at 1/4 and one 5/16" bolt. I placed the arm between textured transitions. This seemed the most unobtrusive choice. Here are some accurate gallery shots. In my self-aggrandizing mind, from the patron's perspective, these mounts are fairly inconspicuous, and when they are noticed, they are not offensive. I believe on the right you can see why we painted the arms the wall color. I'd like to point out I took advantage of Noguchi's notch in the beam to complete the securing of the back and top plate to the central beam. Lastly, we add bolts securing the inner side plates to the floor. One here and here. And a cover plate for the back wall frame. The seeker sought. With friends. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Vincent. That was really an excellent presentation and impressive mount.
Thank you.
We'd like to start the Q&A session if you're ready. And Sam, you'll take us into that?
Yes, I will. Hi, Vincent.
Hello.
I'll just start asking you some questions.
Sure.
Oops. Okay, the first one is, do you feel like you learned anything new for yourself about Noguchi after working so incredibly closely with this object?
Oh my God, that I feel like Noguchi is always teaching me something, and I don't know if I learned things, but it made me think of a lot of questions, and certainly in the overall exhibition, understanding his relationship to his culture and his cohort, Saburo Hasegawa, how they influenced each other and their friendship, and then looking at that and how that relates to their sculpture, certainly was very, very inspiring and something that I didn't really know before.
Yeah, wow. Such a beautiful project, Vincent. There's another question about, is there any reason why the original museum didn't use mounts on the sculpture?
You know, every museum has a different culture. They're not so concerned with earthquakes in Queens, although you know they might be, but they're also you know they want to. It was Noguchi's New York studio, and I think that might have something to do with it. They want to try to keep things as kind of historical as possible, and so those kinds of concerns for them, I wouldn't, you know, we have other concerns at the Asian Art Museum, but for them, I think those trump some of our concerns. But you'd have to ask them, I suppose.
Yes, sure. There's a couple of related questions here. So was this a permanent exhibition, or how long was the sculpture on display? Because I guess there's this real thing about, you know, that decision making and for the mount, you know, and the risk and sort of how long it was going to be on display. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah, the exhibition was only up for I think about 2.5 months, and I know that sounds like a short time, and why we put so much like why didn't a more liberal risk assessment go along with that? And at our museum, we sort of take and especially as I get more and more experience, and I take seismic events more and more seriously. It's more of our museum risk assessment as opposed to individual sculptures. Someday we're going to have a catastrophic event, and on that day, whatever piece we have on exhibition is going to, you know, it's going to receive, you know, whatever damage happens during that event. And so we don't look at it as per sculpture, but it's like eventually this is going to happen, and we need to be prepared for it in any event.
Yeah. And I guess to that, I was curious as to how much it cost, because it just looked so complicated and complex and time consuming. Do you know how much it cost in the end?
Yeah, I don't know exactly exactly how much it costs. It was certainly, not just my labor, but we hired Yutong is an on-call that we've had working with us for a few years now, and I'm very grateful for his fabrication expertise. And then the amount of materials, was, certainly, I don't know, I would say around $5,000 or more in materials. But I also look at it in terms of what we spend during exhibitions. I mean, certainly plexiglass just to cover everything up costs that much money. It's all sort of relative. I'm not the money person, but I try to advocate as much as I can for, if we want this object to survive a seismic event, this is what we need to do for it. And so I work very hard at our museum, kind of politically, to advocate for the work. And I want to also thank these forums, because and being allowed to talk during these forums, because my museum actually sees that and learns to appreciate the work that our department does more. And so making this visible, it's nice to be able to express ourselves and show our work, but it also really helps in advocating for the importance of seismic mitigation.
Absolutely, Vincent. Such important work. I guess there's a related question here around, would the original museum want to keep your mount for their sculpture? Is that an option?
It certainly is an option for us. We don't mind, sharing our work. And sometimes there have been instances where they say, "Well, should we charge them?" And I always advocate for, that we should just let them have it. Although usually when I make mounts this large, I have to say honestly, no one really wants them, because there's no way of really storing them, or they'd have to pay me to try to install it in the place. So again, money becomes an issue when these sort of things, when we make these suggestions.
Yeah. So John asks, was there any kickback from curators for not showing this great piece in the round?
No, it had been, when it was originally shown at the Noguchi Museum, it was shown against the wall. In this particular show, it was shown in the round at the Noguchi Museum and other venues, but and so they've seen it displayed in different ways. I would have liked to have shown it in the round too. The other issue was that there was a space issue in our exhibition, and things had, we only had a limited amount of space in our galleries, and it just, the way it was designed, it was easiest to put it against the wall for a number of those different reasons.
Thank you. There's a question here from Jane that says, were you able to get all the needed templates without rigging the sculpture, or did NY planning steps include handling and rigging? I
actually was able to make all the templates without rigging the piece, and I sort of, for instance, like that footprint, I was really worried about getting that the footprint of the piece, and so I had to piece like a puzzle piece different templates together and go around it, and I was actually really afraid that, because the more components you have, the more you can create inaccuracy, and I was very fortunate that I was able to keep the accuracy without having to rig the stone. But yeah,
amazing.
I was really worried about that.
Yeah. So there's a couple of related questions here around, firstly, were there any quakes during the exhibition?
I don't. I mean, there are always there are constantly earthquakes in California. I don't remember there were any things that we actually felt. I don't during the exhibition. So I would have to say no. Of course, there was probably like a 1 or a 2 happening, rattling around somewhere as they do weekly, but nothing that you can really feel beyond like the ambient, vibrations you get just from wind and machinery and walking and things like that.
Okay. And so there's another question here from Jason that's around, was the entire exhibition space constructed or retrofitted in consideration of seismic activity?
Yes, definitely. We always try to, the original, the museum itself was, we put a lot of thought into thinking about seismic activity. The walls were built to get seismic mounts into them. And even in that case, I retrofitted the walls even more for this particular piece. And then in the installation itself, the different pedestals and things were engineered thinking of seismicity, certainly.
Okay, and I guess from my perspective, all this, I live in Melbourne, so earthquakes are not as common. And I guess I'm just wondering, what sort of consideration is there around damage that would occur to the object if there was an earthquake? How do you determine that? With the mount and sort of all that decision making.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if I understand the question exactly, but we try to keep as, we don't want to have, of course, any damage at all. And sometimes that just can't be helped. Even if, for instance, if we had, a giant quake and our base isolators failed and, things happen, then we really can't do too much about that. But our building was I think I showed a slide in there that showed the floor spectra in our building, and that was to show whatever pedestals that we have put into the building, how they would perform, and they want us to build our pedestals not to anticipate an earthquake, but to be very, very stiff, and the building itself will do the work of tuning itself to the earthquake. And so we try to create a system that's very, very stiff when we can. I could talk about this for a while. I've talked a lot about it in other venues, but residents can be a big problem, even with a base isolated building, and it has to be considered even more so in a base isolated building because you're changing the tuning. You're basically retuning the building. I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah, these are trying to mitigate. They're really difficult problems, and these decisions you have to go piece by piece. And we try to create some sort of standard in our building. And we're very fortunate in our building that we have, it pre-engineered, but we still have to think a lot about it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just great for me to hear that and learn about that. I was just thinking about all that modelling and how do we do projections and how do we sort of guesstimate, I guess, any potential damage when we're constructing the mounts. So thank you. We've got a few more minutes. We might just go a little bit longer. There's a question here around what epoxy putty did you use? A very practical question.
Yeah, we use epoxy is epoxy sculpt, which is I think a lot of other museums use it, and they're yeah, it's a pretty common 2-part epoxy putty.
Thank you. Another question here from Ian, which is how often do you engage an engineer to do design or analysis on mounts, and how do you decide if professional engineering is required?
Well, we do it, I don't know, whenever we get, I mean, I wanted to bring an engineer on this particular piece, but it just was not within our cost. But certainly I would have demanded it if I had some really larger questions. For instance, all the calculations that I showed and that I've talked about before, it's basically 6th grade algebra. It looks really scary when you're looking at it, but I'm not a great mathematician, but if I can, you know, work out, like if I know what the fasteners can take, if you know, I know what kind of forces to expect, I can use, you know, pretty simple calculations to understand things. Now, if I get to a point where that's not going to work, that I'll get to a point where this math isn't going to help me solve this problem. I can't do, you know, finite element analysis or differential equations. I'm not that good of a mathematician by any means. And then at that point, if I'll start bringing in an engineer, and I'll tell the museum, look, if we need to go further with this, we need to bring engineering into an engineer into this. And so yeah, and I have some really wonderful collaborations with engineers, seismic engineers in the Bay Area, and I've learned a lot from them. So I'm really grateful for those instances when we can bring in engineers and we can afford that.
Absolutely. Amazing. And the final question is, was there ever a discussion about the possibility of pins going up into the basalt element instead of obstructing the outside?
There was not, and mostly because, I mean, I have occasionally done that in the past with our own pieces, and usually there were cases when there were already holes in the piece, and so, you know, it had already been, this sort of invasive process had already begun, and so we tried to avoid that when we can. And this was a borrowed piece, so certainly I don't think that was a question. And the Noguchi Museum is pretty sensitive about those sorts of things.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Vincent. That's it for the questions. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.